director of the workshop. I'll just give you a very quick idea of what we do here. I suppose you could say we support the behind-the-scenes activity of the artistic outlet you see in galleries. So we are a place where artists can come to make work, to test and develop ideas and processes, and to progress their practice through lots of professional opportunities that we develop for them. We also employ artists to deliver our very busy public education program, which we run with local schools and for adults, and also professional development for artists. If you are interested in learning more or coming to our events, you can sign up to our mailing list at the end of the event.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here in the Sculpture Workshop, this beautiful building, one of the finest buildings in Edinburgh, I think. So my name is Neil Cox, and I'm the director of the Artist Rooms Research Partnership, which is a 5-year partnership between University of Edinburgh, Edinburgh College of Art, and Tate and National Galleries of Scotland, focusing on this major collection of works by mostly living artists. There are now 41 artists in the collection. Philida Barlow was the last one to join. The Royal Excellence Grant before that. And in fact, there's a big Joseph Wyss show coming up this summer, Artist Rooms artists, Joseph Wyss drawings, and related material at the Modern Gallery. So we run all sorts of events. These are events mostly delivered by a team of interns who are the very capable looking people around you. And the events we run include film screenings. So last night, there's some people here who were at a film screening last night in Somerhalder on of the world of Gilbert and George. And we also run these events which are called Café des Artistes. Now normally, everyone's sitting around cafe tables, but here you're sitting in rows, but I'm not going to let you go into passive mode. So the way these events work is that we're going to have 2 talks around one of the artists in the collection, Ron Mueck, by some really interesting people. I'll tell you about them in a moment. And after they've spoken, they're going to set you some homework, something to think about, and then we'll have about 20 minutes during which you can apply yourself with a wine, and you must talk to people about this stuff, including people you don't know. So you can turn each other around, you can mingle and stuff and think about material. There is a postcard, it was made memoir on the chairs, and also you'll find our evaluation forms, which we would really appreciate if you would complete towards the end of the event. And you can find out all about what we do through those very high-tech links. So, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. The first speaker is Lara Demori, who's a PhD candidate in History of Art at ECA, working on Elio Wojtycka and Piero Manzoni. And you can ask her how she connects them during the interval. And our second speaker is Rachel Wells from the University of Newcastle, one of our partners in the Research Partnership project. And Rachel's been there a few years now. She's published a book on scale in contemporary sculpture, which you can talk a bit about scale this evening. And she's now working on, I've forgotten.
No, I have questions of distance, particularly in relation to Steve McQueen.
Distance in relation to Steve McQueen. That's the artist, Steve McQueen. Yes. It's hard to take a distance. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Lara.
So, hello everybody, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to speak from here because we can't stay there because we don't have a remote control, but please concentrate on the images. My presentation is going to be quite overwhelming in terms of number of images. And I decided to start with this image of Ron Mueck working because first it's quite impossible to find photographs of him, of his face, of him in a relaxed pose or just posing from the camera. He's always working. On the images you find of him, he's always working. And this really stress the fact that how he's concentrate on the process of making, and how this process of making requires physical effort and high level of technical skills. But we know his face from his self-portraits. He made 2 self-portraits, which are 2 masks. There is another one, which is like, he has a quite severe and thoughtful look. While in this one, it's quite I don't know, sleeping. So, and it's quite, and you can see from this work already, like that is quite a gigantic face. And if we look closer as a Mueck's work, we can spot some of his major characteristics, so the issue of scale and the high level of details. But he was not formed as an artist. He's a self-taught visual artist. He started working for cinema and advertising and television in making mannequins. And he at some stage he worked also for Jim Henson as a master puppeteer of the Muppet Show. And he also creates special effects for such famous films such as Labyrinth, starring David Bowie. So he had a complete different formation, and he became an artist almost by chance, because his mother-in-law, the famous painter Paola Rego, asked him to do this little sculpture for an exhibition of spellbound art and film held at the Hayward Gallery in London in 1996. So he asked Mueck to do this little Pinocchio, which is a quite strange small figure with this naughty look. And Saatchi, Charles Saatchi, the famous collector and art dealer, saw this sculpture and was quite impressed. So he commissioned for his own collection, he commissioned 3 works to Mueck. And he also decided to exhibit Mueck in the famous exhibition Sensations at the Royal Academy in London in 96-97, which it's very important for the beginning of the commercial interest in young British artists. So he was like this work marked Mueck's success in a way as an artist. This is another quite impressive work, and of course, as I said before, if we look at this work, we can spot the major themes that are interrelated in Mueck's practice, like the exaggeration of physical features and scale, the exploration of the ages of man, the representation of human times, temperament and emotional states, and the ambivalence between this hyperrealism and the issue of fantasy as well, because they are never life-size sculptures. And also this kind of the feeling that the viewer, the sort of feeling of uneasiness that the viewer has in front of these sculptures. But what I want so I'm not an expert on him, but what I'm going to do in this talk is try to emphasize what for me is what is my personal response to it, so what I find more interesting in his practice, that is the influence of Western tradition. So this work is one of the earliest work that this was shown at the Sensation exhibition that I mentioned before, and he had quite shocking response from the public, because it looks like a real human dead body in a quite striking way. At the same time, it's quite small, so it's smaller than life size. So it has it elicits an ambivalent response from the viewer. And it has been said that Mueck's obsession for details can be compared, for example, to this famous Albrecht Dürer's painting, The Painter's Father. So in the same way that Dürer portrays the aging of his father, could be compared to Mueck's attention to details. But in terms of iconography, I think to me is most striking the comparison that we can draw with another German Hans Holbein, The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb, which is a very real depiction of Christ, quite shocking because we can see the bones on the hands, on the feet, and on the chest, and he has like the eyes open, the mouth open, and Dostoevsky seeing this work said it's so real that it makes the viewer to lose his faith. So it's not like we are in front of like a transcendence creature or like a sacred person like Jesus indeed, but it's like we are in front of like a real dead body. And of course Hans Holbein was influenced by the depiction of Christ in the famous Matthias Grunewald crucifixion. So there is all this German northern realism that could be also parallel to Mueck realism. Another particular work of one of Mueck's early work is this angel. So it's quite a strange figure as well, because he's on a very high stool with this very big pair of wings. It's almost like these wings are bigger than the figure of the little man itself. And he has a very thoughtful look. And it has been said that Mueck was influenced for his angel from this Giovanni Battista Tiepolo allegory with Venus and Time that he could see at the National Gallery in London. And indeed, if you see at the winged creature, that I'm not sure whether there is an angel or not, it almost like looked like Mueck's depiction of an angel. But there is another striking reference to me that could be compared to Mueck representation of the angel, which is Albert Dürer's depiction of the famous woodcut Melancholia. Not just in terms of iconography, so the shape of the angel, but also because Dürer woodcut aims to represent a particular temperament, a state of mind. And if we go back and look at Mueck angel, we are not really thinking that we are in front of an angel. We are more struck by his thoughtful expression. It's like an expression also almost of melancholy. Another theme that could be belongs to tradition is the theme of the mother and child. This work was made by Mueck in 2001 when he was associate artist at the National Gallery in London, and of course he was associate artist from 2000 to 2002, and he made this work on purpose for the exhibition at the National Gallery in 2003. And of course, at the National Gallery, Mueck was able to see a lot of depiction of mother and child, in particular of the Virgin Mary and the infant Christ. And indeed, it has been argued that he was influenced by a specific painting, that is the Virgin and the Child in the interior of the workshop of Robert Campin. And this is a very tiny oil on oak. And what is more particular, what interested Mueck mostly, is the depiction of the child, which has quite like an unusual pose. So when we look at this painting, we look at the bond between the mother and the child, but we look also at the strange features of the child, which is quite normal for Mannerist and Renaissance tradition, like depicting all this, the body of the child almost out of proportions. But Mueck decided to represent a moment in the bond between the mother and child that is always excluded from tradition. So in these sculptures, which is quite tiny as well, is smaller than life size, the baby has just arrived. So, and we can see it's like glistening with mucus, the umbilical cord is still attached, and the mother has just given birth, so her muscles are still tense she's like mobile, like completely stuck in this position. And she looks at the baby with almost an expression of shock. It's like she looks at him, but she can't recognize him as her child yet. So Mueck wants to display something that we are not used to see, a very private moment, and the viewer in this case will feel like we are almost interrupting like a moment of of utmost privacy. So that's quite to show some like differences compared to the traditional representation of the mother and child. And another figure that I like much is this untitled man. So this man has a very erratic pose, a very severe and truthful look. He looks at the viewer quite directly, and he holds with an hand his vest, his white vest. So we feel like we are almost in front of a priest or a prophet. The twist is given by this very contemporary trench coat that we don't really know why it's there almost. And if we look at Donatello's representation of Jeremy, not only like in terms of iconography, so this statue, of course, he's holding the vest, he has a similar, very confident and severe look, and also has a very erratic pose, is a prophet. But I'm not mentioning Donatello by chance. I want to mention Donatello in comparison because Donatello inaugurated another kind of like realism in sculpture that we can see in both in the Habakkuk and in the Penitent Maddalena. She's made of wood and it's very realistic. So I think when we should think about tradition in Mueck, we need to understand what kind of tradition is implied in his sculpture. And this is another sculptural complex. It's a quite unique because it's in a place in northern Italy. So it's polychrome sculpture. It's a very wide complex of polychrome sculpture depicting biblical scenes. And here the insistence is, of course, on the grotesque. There is a vernacular stratus in these sculptures. And if we look at the figure of the rock, for example, is very deformed, is very exaggerated, and it's almost like he's wearing a mask. So it's like they looks like a figure that belongs to the carnival tradition, not really to high sculpture tradition. And there is another part of this complex of sculptures in northern Italy from the Baroque. This is a very Baroque scene. It's quite striking because it's a very chaotic scene. It represents the Massacre of the Innocents. So with all these twisted bodies, like exaggerated facial expressions, we don't really understand where we are in looking at this scene. And what is more interesting for me, if we look at like Mueck child, so if we look back actually at this picture, we can see that the ground is covered with the dead bodies of children, which is something that they decide to add it later to augment the brutality of the scene. So like they're really trying to, I don't know, to convey a religious message through a high, like, emotional response from the viewer. And so what is striking me mostly is like the depiction here of the sculptures of the babies almost look like, in their exaggerated realism, almost look like Mueck's depiction of the baby. The swaddled baby on the right, but also the first baby on the left, which is a quite unusual but truthful pose, so that we are not actually used to see the depiction of babies like this. And of course, in terms of like the tradition of the grotesque, there are other models, other sculptures that can be related somehow to the work of Mueck. So these wax models are very specific. In this case, this one is the composable statue of a pregnant woman. It's called the Medici Venus, and it's in a museum in Italy. And it looks like a very idealized beauty with a twist of kitsch with the pearl necklace, actually. But they're also they're made to be like opened, so we have like a different perception. And there is also like a high debate whether we should consider these artworks or not. Because of course they start being employed like for medical classes at the university, these wax models. And they sort of like went out of tradition. Apart from in some contemporary artists like Kevin Turk or Maurizio Cattelan, so Mueck doesn't use wax. He uses like fiberglass, silicone, so industrial materials. But there are some contemporary sculptures that actually still employ and still carry on the tradition of wax models in a different way. Like for example, Kevin Turk and the famous Maurizio Cattelan, The Ninth Hour. And if we look at another contemporary artist, and this is going to be the last part of my talk, Duane Hansen, Tourist, we are in front of like a similar truthful depiction, despite Duane Hansen doesn't play on scale, so all his figures are life-size. And they are so real that if we bump into sculptures in a museum, we think they are just tourists as us seeing the exhibitions. But of course, in Duane Hansen, even if we see Queenie, there is a different satirical approach to humankind. Particularly, he's trying to like make a commentary on a specific social class, which is the middle-low American social class. And probably, as in this case, in making visible some invisible layer of the society. Well, if we go back and look in Mueck, we have a totally different perception. So looking closer at this work, and it's part of the Artist Room collection, we know that this is like they're supposed to be a representation of love in a couple, because they're clearly in a postcoital moment. And they are together because like their legs are bonded together, but they're also closing themselves. They're almost like alienated figures. So they are together, but they're separate at the same time. And the same thing we could say about this other couple, which is compared, so this one is quite, if you look at the measurements, it's quite tiny and is on a very high length. While this one we are at the opposite, is I think one of the most gigantic Mueck sculptures. So here we see that the woman is almost trying to make a connection with the man, but the man is almost like looking elsewhere. So they're both absorbed in their own words. And all Mueck's figures have this very thoughtful and kind of like melancholic appearance in a way. So my question for you, my two questions are, is a reference to traditional Western sculpture helpful for understanding Mueck's work? And do Mueck sculptures feel contemporary to you, or they feel out of time? So maybe this is something that we should talk about later.
Thank you very much. We'll just move on and we'll come back to that memory later on.
Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on this. Microphone, can hear you. I'm going to concentrate on this issue of scale that Lara's already been talking about within Ron Mueck's work, particularly thinking about the contemporary in terms of contemporary sculpture and a trend of recent artwork that's been addressing scale, and trying to contextualise Mueck within that trend. So Ron Mueck's sculptures, as you can get a sense of already from Laura's presentation, are startlingly visceral, I think, when you encounter them in the flesh. And one thing to say at the beginning of my talk, I think, is how difficult it is to convey these sculptures accurately through photography. Obviously not just because of the scale, but because of the kind of fleshiness of them. So every detail of his figures' bodies appears kind of alive from there. They've got very hairy arms, they've often got glistening eyes, wrinkled skin. As Lara mentioned, you can sort of see the contorted muscles in this piece in particular. Indeed, the only aspect of these figurative sculptures that is not uncannily realistic is the aspect of scale. And so Mueck is really highlighting the scale of change by making everything else so realistic, I think. And as Lara said, he consistently either miniaturises or enlarges his sculptures, never makes life-size work. So sometimes they're miniaturised as in this piece, and I think one of the things interesting about his use of scale in this piece is it's almost as though the scale change between the mother and the baby that she looks so surprised by in this image is reflected in that between the viewer and the sculpture, so you're almost feeling parental yourself when you look at it. So he's also made gargantuan enlargements. As you can see, this is Untitled Boy from 1999, which was first displayed in the Millennium Dome, and later in the Venice Biennale. Just Screening Couple, which Lara mentioned, this tiny sculpture of these two figures, which is in the Artiste collection. So the size of the sculptures undermines their apparent human physicality then, but I think it's also key to the work's ability to grip the viewer beyond a kind of immediate shock and an amazement at the artist's skill, because I think that is the first impression, certainly personally, but I think for a lot of people from comments I've read in exhibition books at the end where people can leave comments. It's the skill that seems to kind of grip people first of all. But then there is this question of why the artist has allowed this aspect of unreality through this use of scale to enter into his work. So the three artist rooms sculptures are exemplary of his wider oeuvre, I think, in this respect. So we have Wild Man from 2005, Mask 3 from 2005, both enlargements, and A Girl, which I've already shown you, which is this absolutely enormous newborn baby from 2006. And they highlight this remarkable technical detail of Mueck's creations, which, as Lara said, he gained while working in special effects for the film industry. And these sculptures also demonstrate, I think, Mueck's interest in depicting a variety of demographics, which we've seen increasingly with his recent work. So his chosen subjects range in age, gender and ethnicity, and we've seen that extended in Mueck's recent work with increasing extremes of age. So we have this newborn, which apparently the artist was prompted to create after he had a child himself, and he realised that although this baby was very small, he's talked about, he felt like it took over the whole house. And so this is partly what drove him to make such an enormous girl. To this very diminutive, this is a very small sculpture of an old woman in a bed, so we've got again extremes of age. And more recently he's extended this demographic with making more overtly political and perhaps art historical here references too. This is a depiction of a black boy investigating his own wound in Youth 2009, as if in sort of Caravaggio-esque style. He's his own sort of Downton Thomas. But it is the shocking changes of scale within these artworks which presents the viewer with sudden shifts in perspective, and which mean that Mueck's sculpture is regularly discussed by critics as in terms of transforming all of his viewers into Gullivers or into Alices. This is reference to sort of myth and fairy tale and satire, of course, with Swift, although I'm not sure that's exactly what Mueck is interested in here. So it's this scale change that I want to focus on in my talk. And I want to suggest that Mueck's practice should be viewed within the context of a recent trend of sculpture that's addressed scale. So really since the 1990s, many artists, a lot of them young British artists, as I mentioned, these artists include Mark Wallinger, Robert Kuzmarowski, Mona Hartoon, Domo Sug, Gavin Turk, not all of them British by any means. It's become an international trend, I think. These artists have been creating sculpture that does address scale through enlargement, miniaturization and use of the life size. So just to give you a very quick few examples, this is a toy fire engine enlarged to life-size scale by the American artist Charles Ray. This is a German artist, Karen Sander, creating these absolutely tiny figures that are then positioned in this rather lonely setup within a gallery. So they're just a couple of examples of this emergence of a sculpture that emphasises scale. It's become quite a conspicuous element of contemporary art. So Judith Collins, for example, in her recent survey of sculpture today, defines an exploration of size and scale as one of the central trends in contemporary sculpture. So what I want to focus on are some of the main ways in which Mueck and contemporary artists have used manipulations of scale. And there are some recurring motifs that scale has been used for, and I'm going to draw out four main areas. The first is an expression of a psychological or emotional state. The second is a presentation of issues related to control. The third is a route towards the comical or the humorous. And finally, an investigation into a perception of distance and perspective. So not all of these artists are interested in all of these things. I don't know if it's particularly, as we'll see, but nevertheless, these are some interesting aspects of recent artwork addressing scale. So I'm just going to show you a few central examples in this quick talk. But finally, what I want to suggest when I close the talk then is that as well as these various uses of scale to express particular concerns, overall I think this trend in which Mueck is a key figure can be interpreted as presenting a faith in the relationship between measurement and meaning, at a time in which many thinkers and writers were arguing that that had disappeared. So I'll talk about the ways in which recent philosophers and geographers and writers have argued that our sense of scale at the moment is being eroded and attacked or even lost. And I think that's the interesting theoretical context in which we should look at this artwork. So firstly then, this scale has been used as a means of outwardly suggesting an inner state. So Mueck's figures are frequently discussed by critics in terms of their presentation of an inner emotional psychological state. And Mueck sometimes chooses to physically enlarge subjects to emphasise their psychological smallness, such as here I think the big man, this is an enormous sculpture from 2000, a gigantic naked man contorting himself I think into the tiniest amount of space possible. My interpretation anyway is that he has a sort of uncomfortable awareness of his own physicality that he's not entirely at home with. Another sculpture by Mueck, this is a 252 centimetre high pregnant woman from 2002, amply portrays the sort of remarkable expansion and strength of the body there in the child. So if you see this up close in the gallery, you can notice the kind of gigantic swollen pink ankles. You can see every sort of vein painted on meticulously. But it also shows the expansion and strength of the body that can give birth as well. So you can see this sort of stretch rotundity of the stomach. So the literal enormity of Mueck's sculpture sometimes reflects the immense physical and psychological demands of pregnancy. Similarly, Ghost, an early work from 1998, this is a girl who is 202 centimetres tall, leaning back against the wall in her swimsuit, her head lowered to the side, as you can see, sharply conveys a kind of teenage sense of embarrassment, perhaps, or helplessness at the unwavering physical presence of her own body. So that's the key way in which Mueck's sculpture is often interpreted, I think, as this presentation of an inner emotional psychological state. But secondly, as well as presenting or prompting an emotional psychological condition, exaggeration of scale has sometimes been made to present effects of control. And this is particularly true of enlargements. Susan Stewart has written a remarkable book about scale called On Longing, Narratives of the Miniature by Gigantic, the Souvenir and the Collection. And she argues that there tends to be an expression of the external, the public, the dominant through enlargement, whereas miniaturizations prompt an understanding of the internal, the domestic, or the manipulatable. And there's often something sinister in sculptural enlargements, I think, and this is capitalised upon here by Damien Hirst in Him, which is this enlarged childhood toy, which is designed to be a kind of safe, maybe educational plaything, but in its enlargement here to kind of beyond all normal proportions, it sort of reduces the viewer into that role of sort of safe plaything. So you end up being dominated by something that you originally meant to be in control of yourself. So you're sort of forced to confront the threat that's continually exposed in horror movies, I think, when you encounter works like this. This is something made in our own image, perhaps a parody of human anatomy created for the sake of education, that's become enlarged on a scale that renders the human sort of very vulnerable. And of course it has a punning title, Him, suggesting a kind of worship, I think, as you can see from this picture, of our own physicality perhaps, that's expanded beyond all reasonable proportions. A sort of extremity of self-obsession and delusion that in turn exerts a sort of extreme control over that which created it. And Mueck has sort of investigated this connection between enlargement and control, I think. This is the other mask, Lara showed you the one where he's sleeping, but this is his own face as he imagines it would appear to his children when he's telling them off, that he's talked about. So there's certainly a sort of understanding that the scale change, again, between parent and child will add to that sense of menace, I think, that he's presenting here. Thirdly, I think exaggerations of scale have been used to present humour. Just as the French philosopher Henri Bergson has claimed that exaggeration is always a key facet of the comic. So artists including Gavin Turk and Maurizio Catalan, again, have played upon enlargement and miniaturisation as a tool with which to deal with their own artistic identity in a very light-hearted manner. So this is a 2002 sculpture by Turk entitled Of Wild Turkey, and it's just that kind of example, I think. It's this, as you can see, this gigantic white speckled egg, which is also made from fiberglass, just like Mueck's pieces. So this measures 210 centimetres high with a 135 centimetres diameter. So this piece may reflect Turk's fascination with ideas of origin and originality and self-reflexivity and identity, I think. So the title again is a pun, both on the artist's name as well as the French word for egg and the term for an artist's life's work, of course. But when it's positioned in a gallery like this and you come across it, it looks as though it's sort of been laid by an enormous animal, and so its absurdity overtakes any serious approach, I think, to any such issues about identity. Similarly, the series of vastly enlarged, these are enormous, I'm sorry it's not a very good image, but vastly enlarged pieces of apparently chewed chewing gum from 1998 present a less than glorious sign of individual creation in the form of enormous indentations of tooth marks and thumbprints on huge white blobs of material. This is made of resin this time. So these appear stuck rather than hung onto the gallery wall as if left there by an unthinking giant. So this exaggeration of scale here is used to present a sort of irreverent humour towards the more traditional aura of artistic authority. And notably around the same period, this is a year later, this is Maurizio Catalan's Mini-Me, a resin sculpture this time of the artist in miniaturised form and photographed as positioned on the bookshelf, sandwiched fairly nonchalantly, I think, in that expression between contemporary art monographs. So he's using scale to play on a similar sense of identity awareness within a canon of art history that Turk was trying to do. And the suggestion of self-parody is emphasised again through his use of titles. So Mini-Me is obviously a reference to the miniaturised clone of Dr. Evil in the Austin Powers films, which are themselves a parody of James Bond stuff on blockbusters, so there's degrees of parody and referencing going on. So again, we see scale used as a signal of the artist's humorous approach, and particularly referencing how big, quote-unquote, the artist has become within the art world. Mueck doesn't often address humour, I think, in his work. This is, as Lara said, his earliest piece, Pinocchio, and another early piece, Angel. And I think they're perhaps the most comical we get. They're otherworldly figures, whereas as you've seen more recently, he's focused on very human figures. And I wonder whether there is some sort of self-referential work going on here, particularly with Pinocchio, this kind of sheepish expression that he's got. It's a very tiny sculpture of Pinocchio. But obviously Pinocchio is famous for having his nose grow in size when he tells lies, and I just wonder if there's something about the kind of deceitful realism of Mueck's work that he's perhaps referencing here. Maybe that's taking it too far, I don't know. So finally, scale and contemporary sculpture has also been used to explore our perception of distance and perspective. And clearly scale and distance are related. As the important minimalist artist Robert Morris said in the 1960s, a very helpful, succinct definition of scale. He says the awareness of scale is a function of the comparison made between that constant, one's own body size, and the object. Space between the object and the subject is implied in such comparison. So you've got a three-way relationship between the object, the subject, and the space or distance in between. This is an artist, Elizabeth Wright, who's played upon this relationship between scale and distance by creating sculptures that are very slightly enlarged or miniaturised. And that often leads viewers to not notice the scale change, and so misjudge the distance between them and the sculpture. So this is a 1994 piece called Untitled Newspapers and Tesco Bag, which consists of these carefully miniaturised sheets of newspaper and a plastic bag. that is so realistic that she's actually had to remake this piece because originally it was thrown away by a cleaner. So it's only by walking towards these pieces, this is another piece that takes these everyday items that, again, like Mueck, appear very realistic, and obviously we're not interested in the human here so much as things that humans have used and worn away. It's only by walking towards and standing next to Wright's sculptures that the viewer realises the extent of its exaggerated size, and thus that it was either nearer to the viewer that immediately appeared or further away. So when you approach these enlarged objects like this one, which is very specific with the scale changes, if these objects have been through some kind of photocopy almost, this is 145% of its original size. It's only by approaching them that you realise that they are further away from you than you expected. So in this way, Wright's work complicates that experience of space and physical depth by exaggerating the scale of an object quite subtly. The space in between it and the viewer is itself miniaturised or enlarged. So in that way, Wright emphasises the viewer's realisation of his judgment. As I said at the beginning, Wright's play with distance is notable in its relation to some of the writing that was going on at the time. So during the 1990s, as theories of postmodernism were still flourishing, ideas of the disintegration of both scale and distance were rife. There's a lot of French philosophers writing about this. Marc Auger, for example, writing his Introduction to an Anthropology of Supermodernity, as he called it, in 1992, he said, "We are in an era characterised by changes of scale, in which we can only cope with the near and the elsewhere." Another French writer, Paul Vrilliot, has diagnosed what he calls a pollution of distances. That was in his book Open Sky in 1995, in which he thinks that the life size is eroding and we're losing our sense of scale. Now, for both Auger and Vrilliot, these changes are a direct result of advances in technology, particularly the development of real-time television and ever faster modes of transport. So these are technologies of globalisation, essentially. And these writers think that globalisation and the tools of it, the technology that's fueling it in part, is altering our sense of the relationship between space and time, and apparently compressing our impression of distance. This old adage of globalisation making the world shrink, I think is relevant here. So, in other words, our understanding of scale is being gradually altered. And that's not the only way in which an attack on scale was deemed to be taking place at the time. As well as these theories that we're losing our sense of scale because of technological developments, there have also been theories suggesting that measurement itself, which of course scale is as a ratio, is become increasingly meaningless. In the 1960s and 70s, which is also when we see some American predecessors to this trend that I've been describing, I think, so people like Klaus Oldenburg and Charles Ray. Artists and writers were questioning the very usefulness of measurement, and this is what Robert Fillion is doing, I think, with this sculpture here. This is his work, Measurement Poems, in which rulers of various lengths lean against the gallery wall, and they're divided not into centimetres or inches, but by shoe insoles or other everyday objects. So, in a way, you can see this as one of the many ways people try and describe scale. I just wanted to show you this is Mark Wallinger's proposal that's as yet unrealised, but I think he's still hopeful that this 50-foot high horse, 33 times life size, is going to exist one day in Kent. But what was interesting, I think, was when he won the competition, which was held to find an artist to make a work for this particular site. It's supposed to be an Angel of the South. There was this idea that you would describe how big it would be by comparing it to other things. So in the press there was regularly discussion that a man would be the size of a hoof, for example, or common things to measure something in terms of the amount of double-decker buses you can fit into it. I think in some ways that's what Robert Fillion is trying to do here. He's arguing that in this work he's questioning the units of measurement that we're using. And in doing that, I think he's also suggesting an essential detachment, perhaps, between a system of measurement and that which is measured. So if the units themselves are given equal emphasis to that which they are quantitatively compared, then just as with metaphor in language, something is something else which it is, in essence, isn't. So a man is 6 feet, or to perhaps quote from one of Fillion's poems, a metre is 10 whistles. Fillion, like other artists and thinkers of the time, suggested a dissatisfaction then with the relationship between measurement and meaning. Mel Bochner, another artist, a contemporary of Fillion, put it this way, I'll just read his quote. He says, measurement is one of our means of believing that the world can be reduced to a function of human understanding. Yet when forced to surrender its transparency, measurement reveals an essential nothingness. The yardstick does not say that the thing they're measuring is 1 yard long. Something has to be added to the yardstick in order to assert anything about the length of the object. This is a purely mental act, an assumption. So I think that quote highlights this essential distrust of measurement that then extended into later theories in postmodernism in the 1970s and 80s, in which writers argued that we should accept the limits of measurement. In particular, writers suggested we should accept the incommensurable, things that can't be measured against each other, and that we shouldn't try to measure those things against each other. And in its most extreme form, this postmodern thinking led some people to claim that there is no real at all to be measured in the first place, as demonstrated, I think, by the press's the press's impulse to describe one thing according to another in order to communicate the size of this sculpture. The idea is we can only understand anything by comparing it to something else. And so if we lose that ability to measure against, then essentially we've lost the ability to describe meaning to anything. So this is the climate, I think, and these are the ideas that are being discussed at the time that Mueck and these other artists are working. And therefore I think it's really more interesting that this trend of scale and sculpture has developed at this time. What I want to argue then is that this trend in some way fights back against these ideas of a loss of scale and a corresponding loss of meaning. So as well as using scale to reference particular issues such as emotional expression, control, humour and distance, the trend builds beyond this, I think, to a wider presentation of a connection between measurement and meaning. And I think this is how I've primarily seen Mueck's work as part of this trend within the context of this thinking. Now, some of the clearest examples of this way in which I think artists are trying to emphasise the relationship between measurement and meaning and suggest that we can still trace a real and establish a value system is through the use of the life size. So Mark Wallinger's Ecce Homo, for example, I'm aware of the time, so I won't go into this too much, but a startlingly life-size depiction of Christ before Pilate that he made partly because it was the millennium, and there was a lot of discussion about the millennium itself, but not about what we were counting. So a striking use of the life size in a position where, of course, we're used to seeing enlargements. Gavin Turk's Nomad, this is another life-size bronze sculpture painted to look like somebody sleeping rough inside a sleeping bag. And Michael Landy's State Britain, again, a sort of striking use of the life size. This was interpreted as making a sort of striking class statement as well because of the discrepancy in style and scale between the Devine Galleries and Tate Britain, where it was shown, and the kind of everyday life-size replica of his parents' semi-detached house, which created these kind of new alleyways within Tate Britain. As I say, Ron Mueck has never made any life-size work, but I think Dead Dad, one of his earliest pieces, and the one that kind of has won him most acclaim, the one that was shown in Sensation by Saatchi, as Lara mentioned, does suggest a relationship between measurement and meaning. So I just want to finish by thinking a bit about Dead Dad. Now, as I said, Ron Mueck continues to emphasise his work's very effective expression of psychological states. However, the emotive tug that Mueck achieves through this combination of realism and exaggerated scale is most poignant, I think, when it's triggered in the viewer rather than viewed in the sculpture. So Dead Dad is the only work that Mueck has made that doesn't try to portray life. There are a few with closed eyes, one of the mouths we saw earlier, but this is the only one that isn't trying to portray an inner life of the figure. Looking at Dead Dad, which is not only highly realistic but also shrunken, as Lara said, it's a tiny representation of a male body. The viewer is not only shocked and impressed by the sculptor's skill, but also prompted to see his or her own relationship to death, I think, and to finite physicality. So you look down on the sculpture from above, and you get a sensation of looking across a kind of vast distance, an impassable chasm between you and this miniaturised figure lying below you. And this dislocation created between viewer and sculpture by the unusual scale relationship is in harmony, I think, with that dislocation between the viewer and death, with this kind of inability to understand it or to experience it, obviously. Rather than presenting the viewer with an unreality that appears mysteriously real, as in Mueck's other work and as in the world of special effects in which he trained, Dead Dad presents a reality that often seems unreal, the small cold fact of death. If the viewer also knows that the unsentimental title refers to Mueck's own late father, I think that only emphasises the almost literal realisation of the viewer's emotions, which is dependent upon the shift in scale. So there's an unfathomable distance between viewer and figure, and this was created at a time when Mueck's father had died on the other side of the world in Australia, so that question of distance had literal meaning as well. So I think in this work, Mueck is solidly reinforcing a sense of scale and resisting any kind of insistence by Paul Virilio, for example, that we are facing a loss of the life size. This figure may not be life size, but he's also not alive. There's a kind of chasm of loss here, which is in no way inaccurate in its sense of scale or proportion. So that's my reading of this artwork, and that's just one example, I think, of an artwork using scale in order to emphasise the persistence of meaning and the importance of measurement, and as I've said, there are many others. Even on its own, though, I think this work by Mueck highlights the importance of scale within a context in which many writers were claiming that it was being sacrificed to human experience. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Lara and Rachel, for those fantastic journeys through different aspects of Mueck's work. I still don't know if I like it. So we've got a bit of time to have a glass of wine and to talk, say 20, 25 minutes, something like that. Think about what we've seen. Now, Lara did set us some homework and Rachel didn't.
Oh, sorry.
Have you got some homework for us?
Do you want to think about this, seeing as we've all got this, seeing as you've all got a postcard of Screaming Couple, which is a tiny sculpture in front of you, I wonder whether you'd like to think about some of the criticisms that get thrown at Mueck in particular. So, is this too sentimental? Is it too mawkish? It's been described as. And does it suggest questions of voyeurism or control that maybe the militarisation normally makes us look at?
Good. Okay, so, and see if you can remember Lara's questions, because it's part of the homework. Okay, so we'll just take a break, and please do talk to your neighbours, especially if you don't know them. So, there was some animated conversation, and found out there are some interesting people in the room coming from different kind of trajectories, including some experts in public communication science, who are here to check us out. So we've got a bit of time now to think about the ideas that our speakers presented, and to hear from you as well in terms of your reactions to this artist or this work, these ideas. So, I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, reactions.
I was interested in the idea of scale, and particularly in relation to the creativity in dreams, because at that time you choose the materials, you choose the setting, the figures, you get a carte blanche because you're asleep and there's nobody else suggesting, only your mind. And how it is that normally in dreams you scale everything according to yourself, and then when you get anxiety dreams, then the scale changes. Things become bigger, you become smaller. And it seems to be that when you're the creator or the artist in your own dreams, you use scale to indicate discordance of some kind and things not being as they should be. In my dreams, anyway. People may have completely different experiences. And I was just wondering in relation to how an artist who's changing the scale and may not articulate why or maybe shouldn't, simply be articulating something of his experience in relation to the object he's shaping.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very important point and an important aspect of Mueck's work, perhaps particularly, is that, I mean, even just in the sort of language that we use to talk about something being unnerving, we say things are out of proportion, or we've lost a sense of perspective, or these are kind of scale metaphors that we use to describe something that makes us anxious or unnerved, or things are not as we think they should be. So I think absolutely that comes into Mueck's work, and his choice of subjects, as you can see in this example as well, often does depict some kind of anxiety or some kind of tiredness or exhaustion or disquiet of some kind. So I think there's certainly that aspect of it. Whether it's depicting dream, he's made that one mask, hasn't he, where he's asleep. Aside from that, I think it sometimes does seem like the stuff of nightmares, encountering his work. Personally, I don't know how you would find it.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, it's like this feeling of uneasiness and discomfort that we feel like in front of his works, and I think this is really caused by this, how he plays with scale. So how the scale actually elicits in the viewer some like an emotional response of uneasiness and anxiety more than attraction in a way. I mean, we are attracted from his works. We are attracted to look at his works because they are so highly detailed and so realistic. But at the same time, we have this feeling of uneasiness and discomfort in looking at these figures because they are realistic and unrealistic at the same time. So it's quite being there's a dreamlike connotation indeed, I think.
Yes, I feel suspicious of the attention to detail. You know, as if that's a way out of the anxiety situation he creates, is to attend to detail.
Yeah, and also like the moments he decides to depict in a way, it causes a sort of anxiety because we are not used to see these figures. They are very, very realistic. I mean, for example, in The Mother and the Child, I personally have a sort of like repulsion because it's something that really happens like this, but we are not used to see it in like a art historical tradition, like the moment that the child is just born. So there is always like playing on this issue of like uneasiness and in front of. So it's both like scale and also what he decides to depict. The subject, yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that, you know, that it really happens like this, but actually that mother and child image I find very disturbing. We were discussing it earlier on, because there isn't a sort of motherly warmth. There is a sort of sense of real detachment. You know, the mother has her fists clenched by her side, and the baby is not at her breast, but on her belly, and she's looking very rigid. And it's an unnerving image, I think, in that respect. It's a sense of alienation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you think.
Absolutely. It's the similar sense of alienation that we have, like in looking at the spooning couple, which are supposed to like depict a moment of love. But what we can infer from this couple is actually a sense of alienation because they're together but detached. It's the same like kind of like what is depicted in The Mother and Child. So we are supposed to see some kind of like affection between the mother and the child, some kind of bond, because that's what is expected from a mother and a child. But actually we have like an opposite reaction. Like she looks at it in a state of shock almost. She almost like she doesn't recognize the child.
Right.
So, and that's part of like the anxiety that these sculptures, I think, allegedly. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that's part of what Mueck is trying to do to his viewer as well. As you say, they're realistic and unrealistic at the same time. We're meant to feel an identification, but also a complete alienation from these figures. So that kind of separation, connection that's sort of made visible in Mother and Child is partly what he's trying to evoke in the viewer of his own work, I think.
Who would like to take it in another direction?
To go back to the mother and child one, a bit of me doesn't feel responsible at all, because I feel that she could actually just be, you know, if you've been through labour, it's a lot of hard work and you're exhausted, and then there's that moment where you kind of go, oh, it's fine, and after that second it's going to be, you know, that's the moment before she relaxes, she's seen the child's okay, the job's done, and then the modelling bit would happen, but she's had a bit of a hard time to get to that stage. So maybe that's what that moment's about. No? Nobody else thinks that. No? How many of you have babies?
Maybe I'm sharing too much, but I had a baby. And I saw that piece in 2002 before I had a baby, and now I look back at it and I think it's actually not as realistic as you might imagine.
Sorry?
It's not as realistic as perhaps Mueck intended it to be. I don't know. Sorry if I'm sharing too much.
I don't know, I don't have personal experience, but I guess you're right. I mean, he's like representing the moment just before, like well, you can hear me even without the thing, I think. Just the moment just before the bond of affection is created. So.
Well, I think it's there, but it's just that, you know, it's like, oh, job done, and the baby's fine. And then
yeah, it's there, but we don't see it.
Yeah.
We see just the moment before. Yeah. We don't see actually the affection between the two. Not yet. We can expect that it's coming.
Yes.
But we don't see it.
Well,
so yeah, I mean, according to me, he deliberately put the viewer in a situation of discomfort, because we expect that the bond is going to be created between the two figures, but we are not in the moment yet. We're just before.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons, if you were to take a more cynical view of his work, perhaps, is that there is this sense of disquiet or alienation that we're talking about, is to avoid these criticisms that have been made nonetheless in the press, that these sculptures are too sweet or too mawkish. And that's why we end up with sculptures that have this, because this could be, apparently with this piece, Mueck initially intended the man's arm to be around the waist of the woman and changed it as he was in the process of making the sculpture. So I wonder whether there is a desire to get away from making sculptures that would present too rosy a picture, partly because that would be less interesting. I don't know, that's perhaps a bit of a cynical view.
Sorry, you mean he was responding to critical or hostile
perhaps
criticism?
preempting it, but yeah, that he would want to avoid presenting anything that was too straightforwardly happy, potentially.
Oh, yeah, hi.
Can I just, it's maybe a short question, but I was just wondering if anyone knew why he moved away from, you know, you looked at the two early pieces, Pinocchio and Angel, both of which are kind of fictional or allegorical or biblical figures, why he totally moved away from that, because obviously, like, subsequent to that, he's known for, you know, this absolute realism, and it just sort of occurred to me when, you know, that it was kind of weird that he started by doing something that's totally, you know, dissociated from that. Is it as simple as kind of, like you're saying, you know, maybe he's kind of susceptible to people's discussions? Is it just that he did Dead Dad and people were so interested in it? He thought, okay, there's a career in this.
I mean, I don't know the answer, but I could tell this is quite likely what happened. It's also kind of like he was looking maybe for success, and he thought, like, I don't know, some kind of like less fictional characters could have like a more like an emotional response from the viewers. So it's also like this issue of scale and of this kind of like realistic figuration is of course a way to I don't know, have the interest and the success with the public as well. I don't want to be too cynical in this because I don't know, and as I was saying before, he doesn't talk about his work that much. He talks about his work just in the process of making. So for himself is really important, all the process of sculpting, and of course he talks about how he wants to represent the emotional states or the temperaments and how he wants to represent the psychological introspection. But I don't know how the shift could be contextualized also in relation to the other artists. On this return to realism and figurativism, in a way, he might be influenced by that. But maybe you have a different.
Again, I don't know. I can't speak for him. I'm afraid I don't know. He doesn't give many interviews, as you were saying, so we don't know a lot about what his thought process has been along his career. I think it is fair to say, again, that he may not have been responding to this or preempting it, but there has been a lot of criticism that perhaps arises out of a kind of snobbishness within the art world, perhaps, that special effects is not high art, and so he needs to distance himself from that part of his career in order to show work in a gallery. And so we move away from anything kind of alien-like or anything otherworldly towards this kind of more serious psychological investigation. Whether that's actually played any part in his career path, I don't know.
I think it's worth remembering that his first time he was exhibiting those things was at the Sensation exhibition, which was very much about shocking images and shocking emotional responses by people, and that may have affected him.
Yeah, quite possibly, I think.
I might have thought, well, mine's just a bit too nice. It's a little,
And then my memory of that, which is hazy, but was that Ron Mueck actually was the one who, in the press, while the rest of the artists were getting kind of routinely panned as being X, Y, and Z, Ron Mueck was the one who the press kind of picked up as being like, that's a real artist. And that was the rhetoric around Ron Mueck for a long time after that.
Yeah, and I think that was because Dead Dad was the one that was shown. I think Pinocchio was in that exhibition as well.
I don't remember. I only remember Dead Dad.
Yeah.
well, I was assuming that those two were the Angel and Pinocchio were in the Sensational one.
No, it was Dead Dad was the kind of centre of the exhibition. It was in this kind of big circular room, and bang in the middle, sort of with dramatic lighting, was Mueck's Dead Dad. Yeah.
This may be an obvious question, but what actually is the source material for Dead Dad? Because, of course, it looks like a mortuary slab photograph. It's a strange envisaging on Mueck's part. I mean, how did that come about?
I don't know. Again, he doesn't give many interviews, so I don't think we have that information, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I think it is certainly quite a realistic portrait of his father. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the details of that.
I mean, I tried to look, I had the similar questions, because at first when I saw it, I was like, oh, maybe he made from the actual, which is quite creepy thought, but maybe he made from the actual...
The death mask of sorts.
Yeah, indeed. But actually, apparently not, because when his father died, his father was in Australia, where he was already working in London. So commentaries were saying that actually he tried to recreate the physical presence of an absence. So he was trying to recreate a moment that he was not present, because he was not there when he actually died. So of course it is a truthful representation, but I don't actually know how, and he never mentioned that. So
the Dead Dad's obviously a smaller size of his actual father. Is there a significance about how much he scaled down that model in relation to the actual person?
I'm afraid I don't know the actual size of his father, so I can't give you a kind of specific.
His father was actually very small.
or maybe it was 2 meters high.
But I think absolutely the actual size he's chosen to depict is very important and gives you an uncanny sense of distance, as I was trying to say, of between you and this corpse lying in front of you. So it's not so tiny as to be a doll. But it's
about that big.
Yeah.
Is it not about half size?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like this?
Yeah, maybe like a meter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it always on the same plinth? That same enormous thing, or has it ever been
I think so,
shown?
as far as I know.
I
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah.
And is that something consistent with his work?
The use of
He tends to sort of designate a particular size plinth for every work.
Yes, I think so.
I think so, and another important thing for him that was reading, and he doesn't want to create narratives. So he really wants to isolate sculptures in a place without creating narratives between each sculpture. So I think like the use of plinth is actually he's doing on purpose because he wants to isolate just a particular sculpture. But that's all I know because it really doesn't talk that much. So all the commentaries we have is just we infer from what we see.
Do you think this kind of preoccupation with, the three ages of man sort of thing, birth, life, death type thing? I mean, do you think that was also part of a sort of trend in this period? I'm thinking there's Bill Viola. I mean, I guess the timing's slightly out, but the triptych, I can't remember what it's called. It's in the Tate collection, I think, isn't it? There's a sort of there's a way in which this art appears to address, the most important human issues, and it trades on that kind of sense of the authenticity of the experience that we're going to have about birth, life, and death in the encounter with these things. I guess the question is, if that's what it's doing, why should we believe that this is doing something particularly meaningful with that? Or is it just actually in that way mawkish, or in that way a sentiment is selling us a sentimental set of truths? We're all going to be born, we're all going to live, we're all going to die. Kind of universalising humanism. Do you think that's fair, or do you think there's something specific about what he does that we should attend to that takes it out of that register?
I don't have an answer for this because I'm still quite undecided regarding what is at stake in his practice. So also what is at stake in this exploration of the ages of man. So actually that's the doubt I still have. I don't know what you think.
I think it's a really key question thinking about Mueck's practice. I think some of it, perhaps, again, where I sound cynical, but some of it emerges from particular residencies he's had. So, she had a residency in the National Gallery where I think part of the purpose of the residencies you are specifically asked to respond to the works in the collection. And so he's looking at key art history and perhaps choosing these big universal moments in life is a way of accessing or positioning your work in relation to that art history. And again, perhaps coming back to a kind of self-conscious, this is high art sort of persuasion. But I think there's also something very interesting about this idea about universalism within his work, and particularly in relation to Dwayne Hansen that you mentioned. I think that makes for a really interesting comparison. Dwayne Hansen making Queenie, if you remember Lara showed, and those tourists who Saatchi also loved, and they were also in the Saatchi gallery. And Hansen has always stuck to the life size, and he's always clothed his figures and made them appear, as you said, as if you could come across them. But he's talked about his work as if he's trying to get across a desire of the particular, absolutely, as apart from the universal. And historians like Marco Livingston interpreted his work as fighting against prejudice, fighting against stereotypes. Hansen's work, fighting against prejudice and generalisation by making you hone in on the detail that you're talking about, the specifics of these individuals as they are, rather than stereotypes or generalisations. At least that's one view of Hansen's work. So the fact that Mueck is choosing to use these exaggerations of scale by comparison, and that he's often presenting naked figures, they are still particular, and yet I think they're reaching towards the universal much more than that. And to me, that makes them essentially less interesting, I think, than Hansen's figures for that reason.
We're allowed to do this in the Cafe series, although we are in a research partnership about the Artiste collection. Sometimes we say negative things about them, which we can go off message. Yeah.
Well, I think they are very interesting in general, as I said.
Could you restate your final point there?
Yeah.
Just,
So it's just an interesting comparison with Dwayne Hanson,
yeah.
in that Hanson's work has been interpreted by Marco Livingston in particular as working against generalisation, and in that fighting against prejudice and stereotypes, because he's showing you people that you might see in a gallery, but in this instance you're allowed to go up close and investigate them. And he also, like Mueck, is presenting people often who are exhausted or tired or sort of at the end of their tether, or seemingly sort of depressed in some way. And so there's a kind of social message, as Lara said, to a lot of Hanson's work. And I suppose I was just suggesting that maybe Mueck's work is more universal than that. I didn't mean to suggest I don't think it's interesting. I think it's very important work, but I see it as important as part of the trend I was talking about, I suppose. Yeah. Does that help?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. No other? Good. So it just remains for me to thank our excellent speakers and thank you for coming. Please do watch our Facebook page and our Eventbrite feed, all that stuff. There is an event coming in April, a film screening at the Art Historians Association, which we will be inviting people to come along to. And I hope we'll be running another cafe at some point in the future. We haven't fixed that yet. So thank you very much.